Like this. Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, now the mic is working, so I have two microphones, better two than one. So we discussed the global perspective, the security architecture globally, and now we speak about the Baltic states. Three Baltic states, there has been a much of debate here in the Baltics, and not only in how many hours Russia could be here if they wish to do so. So these and other issues will be those that we will address today. And for that, we will have three excellent speakers. And I will start by introducing all three of them. And the first of them is Jānis Kažociņš, who is the National Security Advisor to the President of the Republic of Latvia. Mr. Kažociņš, welcome to the stage.
That's a great
Good. And the second speaker is Dr. Henning Riecke, who comes from Berlin in Germany. He is head of Global Order Program at DGAP, which is the German Council of Foreign Affairs. Am I right?
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Sven Sakkov, who is the director of the International Security Defense Center based in Tallinn, in Estonia. And without any further delay, let's kick off with the discussion. And you saw the question of Slido: will NATO allies in the next decade establish a permanent military presence in the Baltic states? And the audience is quite positive about this. So we'll come back to that a bit later. We'll start with Jānis. One issue that has been neglected quite often is the trilateral military cooperation of the Baltic states. So there's quite a history, close to 3 decades. There have been many projects. Some are well heard of, others have been forgotten already. Has the Baltic military cooperation been a success, in your opinion?
Well, I think the answer is yes and no. In the very end of 1993, the 3 Baltic chiefs of defense decided at a conference that they would form a Baltic peacekeeping battalion from all 3 Baltic states. In fact, it did come about, and it had combined doctrine, tactics, procurement. In other words, everything that is necessary for the Baltic states all to be on the same page in terms of defense. Unfortunately, then came along the possibility to join NATO, and it no longer seemed quite as important as it did in the early and mid-90s, and the project wilted away. And as a direct result, we have completely different ways of tackling Article 3 of the Washington Treaty. That is, that it is each country's primary role to do as much as it can to defend itself first before we even get to Article 4 or Article 5. So, as an example, in Estonia and Lithuania, there is more an emphasis on heavy weapons, whereas in Latvia, we have gone for very light tracked armored vehicles. Another question which is different in the 3 Baltic states is to do with the all-volunteer force versus conscription, which has been a feature of the Estonian armed forces all the time. Lithuania half-heartedly has begun, and Latvia is quite convinced that we are better off with a very strong National Guard and professional armed forces. So, yes and no.
But if you would have to choose, yes or no?
Well, I don't think anything is black and white, as the BBC constantly try and tell us. Therefore, there are good aspects, but it could be better. I think we really ought to do a great deal more, particularly, for instance, in terms of joint procurement, because it would be cheaper.
Okay, thank you for that. I will go now to Mr. Sven Sakkov, because Jānis already mentioned the different models of defense that have been created in the Baltic states. So we are quite similar in many senses, but when it comes to the military doctrine, the ways armed forces are formed, we are quite different. And the Estonian model is conscript-based, if I can formulate that way. Is this model, so to say, fit for the 21st century? I guess this is something that's often asked to Estonians, at least from Latvia, which has chosen a different path.
Yes. Do you want me to elaborate?
Yes, I'll be happy
No,
to
it's
hear
a
more from
wonderful
you.
question. 2 years ago in Riga, I asked a question at the Riga conference from Jānis, who works at MOD, on whether Latvia new security environment is not considering to reinstate the conscription. And when I heard, and the whole conference heard, that in Latvian Ministry of Defense this is called an Estonian question. That all the time, and every audience, there is an Estonian who asks that question. Why we ask that? Because of course, Latvia is our dear neighbor. You cannot have a better neighbor than Latvia. And I think for a very small country in a very bad neighborhood, conscription is a way actually to be much better, much bigger than your size actually allows. For example, this is the only way for Estonia to field in time of war an army of 25,000. We are regularly having quite large exercises. Last year's exercise called Hedgehog, for example, was 15,000 strong, of which 13,000 were Estonian troops. That also allows us to mobilize very quickly, because when we are in a hot reserve, which is really hot reserve, we also do our own snap readiness exercises, where, for example, a battalion is called without any prior warning out from a reserve, 24 hours, and we have a battalion. So I think this is for a very small country, this is, I would say, the only way to have a sizable armed forces, and that's why we're going to stick to it.
Okay, thank you very much. It's time to introduce our third speaker, and Germany. So you come from Germany. Germany was something that was much discussed earlier today in the previous debates, and Germany is, so to say, unlikely leader of the henceforth presence in Lithuania. So who could have expected Germany after all these issues you have had in the past? And my question would be, how permanent is the German presence in Lithuania? Because we know there is a saying that there is nothing more permanent than, so to say, interim solutions. So what's your take on the Germany currently in Lithuania and the Baltics and in the, so to say, near future?
My answer to that would be that Germany takes this responsibility very seriously. And if you ask for permanence, as the factors prevail and as the conditions are as they are now, you will have Germany on your side. If you had asked me, can we expect more, or will Germany step up its presence, I might have been more hesitant. But let me explain a bit why that is so interesting. Now, Germany always has to balance the traits of its foreign policy. Of course, NATO is the core column of German security policy. But in the same time, you will see the Germans always relatively open to arguments asking for an open dialogue with Russia, tying in Russia in European security. And that is historically driven. I can't elaborate that in the 3 minutes I have. But the Germans take it very seriously and are very concerned when as the conflict level rose with Russia. And all those people understanding Russia and reaching out to Russia have been deeply disappointed by what happens in the Crimean crisis. But Germany has chosen a path of going with the West and asking for sanctions and building up capabilities in NATO. But you have to be aware that we always have to balance what NATO could do or should do with what we think we should actually avoid for not confronting Russia too much. This is why the Germans would usually ask to keep the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the policy of restraint alive, because this is the kind of relation that we want to have with Russia. And if Russia breaks it and moves away from that, this doesn't mean for us that we have to do in a similar way. This is why Germany first chose the spearhead format after the Crimean crisis, to have troops available very, very quickly and mobile to come to all the spots where conflicts might arise. But that wasn't enough, because all you know that possible scenarios of Russian infiltration are so much below the level of Article 5 that it would be very difficult in Western capitals to discuss that as a clear case of an alliance where we have to step in, but rather people would discuss what's really happening and how bad is Russia really for us. And so this is, of course, a weakness in an open flank, but now we have the enhanced forward presence, and that's a good thing because it keeps NATO troops on board. It helps NATO functions in a way to overcome these political challenges. It is also a means to tie in other countries, especially in Latvia, where Italy and Spain are on board. This is a pretty good format. Now, the Germans have decided to go along with that. We didn't invent that because we wanted to have it differently, but we said we go along with it, and we stick to that.
Okay, but in a nutshell, so can we expect also more? Because in the previous debates,
Yeah.
Poland was rightly thanked for being here with their tanks, and we should also, of course, recognize the changes in German defense and foreign policy. But is that it, or so to say, let's wait, a few years, like soon there will be, already a decade since Crimea events, and people in Germany might ask, why should we deploy our soldiers beyond our borders in Lithuania?
As to the enhanced forward presence and the question of permanent or persistent, I don't think you could expect much more in the current lineup and the current security situation. But I think the message is also important. There are a number of homework, or lots of homework that has to be done in NATO to connect the enhanced forward presence, the VJTF spearhead, with the whole structure of the military command, the follow-on forces through the NATO response forces and others. Okay. Mobility is the core issue in the American initiative of the 430s to have like 30 battalions, 30 ships, 30 squadrons available. Okay, so and Germany is supporting that with full force with the headquarter we built up in Ulm and southwest of Germany. So all in all, if you look at the overall spectrum of things to be done, I think Germany is active, and what we now have to do, and we will have this in the question, we have to spend more for our defense. And this is an internal debate. Only 2 days ago in the Bundestag there was a discussion about the defense budget. The Minister of Defense asked 1.7 billion more to come up to 45 billion. It's still below the 2%, but we're moving in the right direction.
So still Germany, I understand, is one of the biggest spenders. I think it's even in top 3 in NATO, so even though the percentage is not that high. But it's time already now to ask for the audience to steer out the debate, because this is your opportunity to ask your questions to our distinguished experts on the defensibility or indefensibility of the Baltic states, everything that we touched upon and did not touch yet. Are there already questions to our experts on the ground floor or the upper floor? So I don't see any yet. No, I have to apologize. I have also a mic, but there is another one coming. So please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Perhaps not so much a question, but a comment on following the question you had to your left neighbor. What about the Baltic cooperation? Honestly, in Brussels, this is a concern. And it does not only concern procurement, common procurement, it concerns about coordinated planning for defense and reinforcement. And here you have to do much better, the 3 Baltic states. You are too, in my view, too self-focused, rather than the Baltic Defense Administration need to understand from a Brussels point of view or a Bronson point of view, you are one operational region. It's not about 3 countries, it's about one operational region. And I place much of hope into the emerging divisional headquarters, which is about established here in Riga, led by the Danes, to take over a coordinating role and reach back to Stettin and also to Bronson. If we need to rapidly reinforce this region, we need you to be ready to receive the reinforcement effectively. So my plea is, please engage in working closely together with the new command in your country here in Riga.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. So the comment quite clear. The Baltic states would need to do more. be able to cooperate and also to take afterwards assistance. And is there anything else that the audience would like to bring up at this point? So if not, so then let's go to this discussion again about the trilateral cooperation. Let's start with Jānis, as he already kicked off with this issue. So would you agree?
No, I think that's an absolutely fair comment, and it is indeed our fault that we haven't done enough. But I wonder if I can, if you'll allow me to spend 2 minutes on answering the question up there about Baltic indefensibility. Frankly, it's a silly question, because it's not a question of can Baltic states be defended, but are we prepared to put enough resources in to defend them? Because of course they can be defended. Let us remember, for instance, that the Latvian riflemen, together with Russian imperial forces, kept the might of the German army in Latvia from advancing until the revolution. And let us remember that the Kurland pocket, part of the Soviet Union at the time, had still not been taken by Soviet armed forces when Berlin had fallen and the war was finished. In other words, yes, it can be defended. The proviso that I would add here is that if we take into account the geography, the land border of the Baltic states with Russia, Belarus, and Kaliningrad is more than 1,500 kilometers, and with NATO is a massive 104 kilometers. In other words, an inner-German border, Cold War type of defense is not feasible and ill-advised. Even worse, when the RAND study, which I think a lot of people are aware of, in 2016 said, on the basis of very sophisticated wargaming by a whole bunch of serving and retired brigadier generals and colonels, wargaming actual existing armed forces, that the Russians would win if they attacked the Baltic states, unless there were 7 brigades in place, including 3 heavy armored brigades. Now, if I were looking at this from the position of General Gerasimov and his staff, 3 armored brigades in what Newt Gingrich so delightfully put it, in St. Petersburg's backyard, Estonia, would make me very, very unhappy. And therefore, within a year, it wouldn't be 7 brigades, it would be 17. Now, that's not what we want. And what we should be concentrating on is not military defense, but rather what is behind it. If we look back at Sun Tzu, through Clausewitz, Little Heart, everyone, the point is to achieve a political objective, not to defeat armed forces or to capture ground. And therefore, not only do we have to have deterrence, a capability of defense, but we have to make sure that the cost-benefit analysis from the Kremlin's point of view makes it absolutely clear that the costs will far exceed any potential gain in economic, in human, and in financial terms.
Okay, and the trilateral cooperation, so what could be done more in this respect? So we know Baltron, basically Estonia is out with its vessels. Are there any projects that we can expect that have basically died out? Had Baltbat, which transformed in a way in a Baltfor, but we haven't heard much of that. Is there anything else? For example, procurements were mentioned as one of the issues, because we see that each of the Baltic states are buying, quite different stuff. So Lithuania is buying from Germans Panzerhaubitze, from the howitzers. Latvia is buying American-made
M109
from M109 from neutral Austria. Estonia is buying them from South Korea together with Finland. Can we expect some more convergence in procurements or other issues among 3 Baltic states?
If you want me to continue, yeah, and I would absolutely endorse that the whole direction has to come from the top, and it needs to be a coordination at the very top about what our defence requirements are, how best to fulfil them, and from that we then trickle down into things like procurement, into things like doctrine. And unless we have it at the top, then we'll continue to find the best deal. The Latvian M109s came for a song. They were very, very cheap. But of course, they do fulfill the purpose. And at the end of the day, it's NATO ammunition that all three use.
Okay, thank you.
It's an interesting aspect of the current posture that NATO has, or NATO states have in the Baltic states, that there is a lot of bilateralism going on. America is building up special relationships with the Baltic states since 2014, with in these years flowing 800 million of military equipment and services to the Baltic states. Most of it is, of course, military sales, which is an interest of the Americans as well. In Poland, with the additional 1,000 to the original 4,500 rotating soldiers, it provided a message, look, we will do more and we will do better. But it is a constant feature of American foreign policy in NATO that they do things bilaterally as well. And one could argue that the enhanced forward presence is also a sort of new bilateralism, because the Baltic states, they look at the lead nations. That's also about military sales, but also with special relationships that are being built up. And don't get me wrong, I think this is still a very good thing. It strengthens NATO presence in the region. It adds to reassurance, it adds to deterrence, it builds up capabilities and even interoperability with especially the American Second Fleet again in charge, that also connects with Sweden and Finland and others. So there is a lot going on which is desirable and helps the security of the Baltic states. But we should see this as a starting point to develop from here on, that these new bilateralisms don't undermine NATO coherence, don't undermine the commitment that currently maybe Italy or Spain or Portugal have for Baltic security. So we have to find ways to build a new regional approach from that on. And I think it would underline that. There's been a paper by actually Dutch and other experts from Canada and the Netherlands who wrote about that, and I found that pretty compelling.
Okay, thank you. Sven, on the Baltic cooperation, so we know that Estonia has sometimes excelled in a way when it comes to broader lines of Baltic cooperation. So what about the military cooperation among the three countries? What is the perspective from the north?
I think the starting point should be much more sanguine than I hear here. What our three countries are actually running a joint military college and a third and fourth level together in English language together. And I have done that for the last 20 years. What other three countries are running the whole air surveillance system together, including putting together a recognized air picture, including weapons control for fighters? I don't see any. Whatever other three countries have actually, for the last pretty much 25 years, have trained in naval affairs together in the same framework of the Baltic states. The Dutch and the Belgium are now basically, in the last maybe 10 years, are coming along. So I think we should recognize what has been done. Now, having said that, I think there's a lot to be done. I think basically building on what we have. For example, in the air domain, I think there is a very clearly, and I think this is recognized well, that air defense is one of the weakest points in Baltic defense. I think it would be very logical to have a trilateral work on it, especially when it comes to a mid-range ground-based air defense systems, their acquisitions, training, and maintenance. Really acquiring something together, this is a question of economies of scale. So Estonia, for example, has done it repeatedly with Finland because Finland has given us scale. And we have been flexible enough to basically jump on Finnish bandwagon. Many years ago, it was when we purchased radars. Finland needed 10, Estonia needed 2. We got 2 for the price of 1 because of the economy of scale. Now, and it doesn't really matter with whom you team up. It matters if you basically, and it really, that's where I'm talking about air defense assets, ground-based air defense, is if you have a training base together, you save money. If you have a maintenance base together, you save money, because all three are still very small systems. Moving on, Navy. I think we should be looking at actually having a joint Navy in a kind of Dutch-Belgium framework in the future. Because all three are too small to have everything, at the same time together. Basically, I think that would be the next one. Heiner Braus already touched upon the questions of advanced planning in terms of basically looking at there are no gaps in between the three different plans. And I think routinely there are things on the procurement on a lower level than having a whole weapon system, I think what could be tackled. And Estonia and Lithuania have bought some ammunition together and so forth. The problem, of course, is that defense is a very inherently sovereign issue for every country. And this is, hence it is not easy thing to do. I will also address the as Jānis said, a silly title of this panel about the defensibility. When this RAND study came out, and by the way, I'm much more skeptical about how it was done because I saw how it was presented in Munich Security Conference 2 years ago. Estonian indigenous forces were represented by 1 battalion because they don't understand the conscript system and reserve army. And we were looking basically what is a standing force. But the game was D+7. By that time, Estonian army is 25,000, or earlier than that. It doesn't take 7 days to get that. And then I really liked that guy, Estonian, then a commander of a special operation forces, Riho Ühtegi, who is now commander of a defense league. He was asked by one Western journalist, I forgot which one, but yeah, Reuters or something of that sort, basically about his friend's study, which said that Russian troops were going to be in Tallinn in 60 days. And the Estonian Special Operations Commander said, well, maybe they will get to Tallinn in 60 days, but they will die in Tallinn. And this is a spirit.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jānis wanted to add something, and then we'll
yes,
again turn to
I agree with virtually everything that Sven said. There's, of course, the question mark of 7 days and whether a coup de main, successful coup de main can be made. But I would like to pick up on the question of air defense. It is simply a matter of fact that the 3 Baltic states with our 2% or even 3% of GDP for defense, we are not going to be in a position to have the kind of proper air defense with its command and control which is necessary to ensure that NATO's strongest assets, which is our NATO air forces, can immediately come to the assistance of whatever forces happen to be in the Baltic states at the time, because they are not going to fly if some conscript or some young National Guardsman hears an aircraft overhead, gets his stinger out and says, well, I think that one's a Russian one, I'll take it down. They will not fly. Therefore, we have to have modern, sophisticated air defense, and let us remember that that is the eastern border, eastern flank of NATO and the European Union. And when we hear some of our NATO allies saying, well, we'd love to spend 2% GDP on defense, but we wouldn't really know where. Well, okay, Luxembourg, for instance, you don't have to gold plate every one of your 1,000 soldiers' rifles. You can help to provide air defense on the eastern flank of NATO. And let us bear in mind that if the eastern flank of NATO goes wrong, if somebody in the Kremlin suddenly has a rush of blood to the head for whatever reason, and the capability is there and the intention changes, then that's not just going to be a headache for the Balts, it's going to have incredibly big headache for the rest of Europe. Therefore, it is without a doubt, an incredibly good investment for them to provide part of their, if they don't know how to spend it, part of their 2% GDP on making sure that our outer border of NATO is properly secured.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking again to the audience. Are there any questions or comments? You can also agree or disagree, reinforce the arguments brought up here. Yes, I see, gentleman in the third row. So microphone is coming. Just a second. So please introduce yourself and then the question, and to whom.
Yes, it's Major Mark Peebles. I'm with Task Force Latvia here in Riga. The question, and I guess it's ironic coming from a uniform member, we've been talking a lot about the military capabilities and the military measures in terms of defense of the three Baltic nations. But my question is, we know that there's been a fair amount of work done on the civilian or the non-military side. For example, energy grid integration into the European Union, unplugging from Russia's grid, things like that. But the question I have, and it's really for any of the three, is how much more work should be done on the civilian and infrastructural side in terms of Baltic defense?
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question in the room? Because this might be the last opportunity to ask question. I see there is one in the back, and also that's over here on the left.
Hello, Dallas Taylor again. From the U.S. I'm wondering about the vulnerability of Russian-speaking Latvians and how that kind of poses strategic vulnerability.
Okay, thank you. Anything else you would like to bring up for the discussion? So at the moment I do not see any other hand in the air. So basically we have two questions, both are, so to say, non-military questions. One is about the infrastructure, so the gentleman mentioned energy, but it's not only about energy. So we know that Rail Baltica is underway, so it's going to be built in a few years. And it will finally connect the Baltic states with the Western Europe, because when we look back to the interwar period, it was possible to go by train to Berlin and to other cities. So now it's unfortunately not possible. And we see how many years, like 4 decades, we will have passed until we reconnect. So that's also a very good question. So I see Sven is ready to start, and maybe you can reflect also to both. The question was asked about the Russian speakers in Latvia, but also in Estonia there is quite a sizable population of Russian-speaking people, and it is often brought up in various discussions as one of the issues. So the infrastructure and the societal risks.
The infrastructure, one is energy grid, basically electricity grid, desynchronization from the Brel system, which is basically Russia, Belarus, and Baltic states, a old legacy thing, and integrating that into the West, basically through Poland and so forth. There are some problems in that, basically one being Polish protectionism. It does not want to get cheap energy from other sources. Maybe that will be done with soon, because Estonia lost its edge in oil shale electricity lately because of the carbon quotas went so high that actually oil shale is not economic anymore to be burned for electricity, not because it's technology, but because actually of the carbon quotas. That would be number 2. Number 3 is the gas infrastructure. LNG terminals, and the distribution and the gas market. Estonia, Latvia, and Finland, for example, is in one gas market. Lithuania opted out, is in another one. So we are talking about basically a need also to have more LNG terminals here to diversify gas market in this region. Number 4 would be actually where electricity is coming from. Estonia now had to close its electric stations running on oil shale. They are kept basically humming in a way. So in the winter, for example, when we're low on energy, they can be used. It's horribly expensive because nowadays actually, the workers and the miners are paid while they are on leave. Next thing would be Rail Baltic or Rail Baltica. I hope it will be constructed as quickly as possible because this is a very clear energy link, a very clear infrastructure link. And I think one of the economic ideas behind that is also that actually when you extend that notionally through Finland to the ports in the sea, when you talk about Northern Passage and basically Chinese goods coming from that onto a European rail network. So basically I think those are huge projects. I think there is some promise in the Free Seas initiative, which is basically looking at the infrastructure which usually runs in Europe, in Eastern Europe, from east to west, to run from north to south and then vice versa. So this is about gas, this is about rail links and so forth, electricity. And I think there are many more smaller things to be looked at. When it comes to the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia, I think all the polls shows that they are very happy to live in the European Union and not in Russia. And I think this is basically the winning strategy in a way. We are not actually that susceptible to a fake news and propaganda from Russian TV stations, especially when you look at Narva, which is a town on the border. And why is that? And this is basically what the researchers who have done kind of deep research interviews in Narva talk, is that when you live in some Western Europe, Estonian city, you don't go to Russia often. In Narva, we go to Russia every day, every week, for economic reasons, buying cigarettes and vodka and gasoline, and bringing that back. Basically, it's cheaper there. So they go to our side in Ivangorod, and they see what life is there. The roads aren't paved, infrastructure is not maintained, corruption, and so forth. So they come back, and we switch on the evening news, Russian news, which says how glorious the life in Russia is. It's getting better. No, it's not. We just were there. When the second segment, the Russian TV talks about how horrible life is in the EU and Estonia. No, it's not that bad. It's much better than in Russia. So it's kind of, in a way, eyewitness, being an eyewitness actually to us comes handy.
Thank you very much for your answers. Dr. Riecke, would you like to respond to the issue of infrastructure or societal
I think
issues?
the two colleagues here from Baltic states have a much clearer view on that. I would have listed, of course, LNG as well, because it's a diversification of gas supplies. We would still very quickly come to the Nord Stream question, which might explain a bit about the intricacies and contradictions of German-Russia policy. I think it's bad that this was done in a very unilateral way and we didn't tie in the neighbors in the European Union enough. But still there is some strategic thinking behind it that if you have economic ties with a possible adversary, it is creating stability and makes military escalation less likely. And the dependency is mutual because Russia needs these experts as well. But the pressure, of course, reaches the German debate about that as well. So we are willing to build up LNG terminals to open to exports from America, which of course have to compete in prices. And that is something we always say. If you Americans, thank you for reminding us about the strategic policy of building Nord Stream 2, but we understand that you want to sell LNG yourself. We're willing to buy, but please try to compete price-wise. And I think there's a long way to go for that. But I think it is also necessary to build that into a European energy policy where the Baltic states are, of course, part of.
Okay, thank you very much. And Jānis,
Yep.
finally you, the infrastructure society.
I think what we're talking about is resilience as opposed to simply military defense. And resilience, of course, are all the obvious things, energy, transport, infrastructure, and so on. But it goes a lot deeper than that. It is actually a question of hearts and minds, as it used to be called in the last century. but the way to perhaps highlight what I mean is that if we look from the Russian point of view, what is the optimum Russian outcome? Well, I would argue that it could well be independent Baltic states, members of EU and members of NATO, but taking foreign policy direction from the Kremlin, and in other words, completely undermining both of these organizations, which are great threats to Russia. NATO isn't a threat to Russia. The European Union is a huge threat to Russia because it offers an alternative to Putinism. For instance, if Ukraine can succeed to be a normal Western country, then the other two bits of the greater Russian state are going to be asking, well, why can't we live like that as well? Therefore, the resilience needs to look at all of these issues. In Latvia, we're going very hard now towards a comprehensive defense system, overarching, bearing in mind that a third of our population, the Russophone population, are loyal to Latvia largely, but they don't think there is a military threat from Russia. And therefore, social cohesion is absolutely fundamental. And it's not just interethnic, it's economic, it's between age groups, all of those things, and a lot of the other things that have been mentioned earlier today. In other words, I think resilience is every bit as important as military defense.
Thank you very much. So every panel has an end, so we have almost reached it. It's only my duty to invite you for lunch after we give a round of applause to our experts and welcome afterwards to the session.